If you ask everyone who's versed in Vintage or Legacy Cube what their favorite deck is, I'd be willing to bet their most common answer would be Storm. And for good reason. Storm grants an experience most other archetypes just can't really offer. Frantically trying to find pieces to a puzzle during the draft, and then trying to put that puzzle together in a single turn during the game, in order to produce a combination of spells that, when played together, yield a result far greater than the sum of their individual text boxes. With that said, the fun of Storm does come with a fairly steep learning curve compared to some of the other decks we've talked about on the channel before. So, today I want to take a look at Storm as a deck and try to dumb it down as much as possible for people who might be newer to Vintage Magic. Before we do that, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this as they're posted, and give this video a like if you find the content useful. So at its core, there's really only three main pieces to bringing together a Storm deck: mana acceleration, card draw, and recursion. This is an oversimplification, but the way Storm decks usually like to play out, we want to start by generating a ton of mana, using that mana to draw cards, and use the cards we've drawn to make even more mana, and eventually, after casting several spells in one turn, cast a spell with the Storm mechanic to win the game. Storm is a keyword that says copy the spell for each spell cast before it this turn. So, for example, a card like Tendrils of Agony would on its own deal 2 damage to an opponent for 4 mana, which is pretty subpar in most decks. However, if it's the 10th spell we've cast that turn, it's an immediate kill just about every time. So while there are definitely certain cards that make strategies like this easier, Storm is really cool because there isn't a single card that we have to make the deck function, and most of the time, in most cubes, there's a decent amount of redundancy for key effects. While we aren't hard locked into any specific color combination, we almost always are going to be base blue, and more often than not going into at least black or red to some degree. Usually we're going to be Grixis. However, I've definitely made really effective, for example, Bant Storm decks before, so take all that with a grain of salt. The mana acceleration we want to look for is a little different than in most decks. Creatures like Birds of Paradise and Signets are fine and you can run them, but we want to be focusing on cheap spells that give us a quick burst of mana. For example, Dark Ritual gives us 3 black mana for the price of 1. Cabal Ritual gives us 7 for 2 if we have Threshold, and Seething Song and Desperate Rituals are very similar cards in red. High Tide lets our islands tap for double until end of turn for 1 blue, and Mana Flare doubles the amount of mana each land taps for. Be careful with this one because it is symmetrical, so ideally you want to play this the turn you plan on winning, or at a minimum the turn before you plan on going off, just so our opponent doesn't get to take advantage of it. These doublers pair really greatly with cards like Turnabout, allowing us to tap all of our lands, float the mana, cast Turnabout, untap them all, tap them again, effectively generating 4 mana from each land with a doubling effect active. So Black Lotus is an auto-include in any deck if we're lucky enough to open it, but Lion's Eye Diamond is a similar card that this deck values very highly and is way less sought after by other decks. We'll talk more about that in a second. It can be a risky play, but when going all in on Storm and we're about to go off, sacrificing our lands for more mana can be an incredibly powerful tool, either as a replacement for or in conjunction with mana doubling effects. Squandered Resources is the best way to do this, allowing us to trade lands for mana of any color after we've tapped them. Reign of Filth is an instant that grants the same ability until end of turn, although only for black mana. And Mon's Goblin Waiters is a creature that allows us to sacrifice lands or creatures for red mana if your playgroup is open to uncards in Cube, which I highly recommend. As far as card draw goes, we want clean, cheap ways to fill our hands. Ancestral Recall is the obvious pick, but we'll probably have a lot of competition for that one. Yawgmoth's Bargain is one of the best enchantments, allowing us to trade 1 life for a card. At 6 mana, it is a big investment, but remember we're going to be generating plenty of mana in this deck. Memory Jar is an artifact we can really take advantage of after we've dumped our hand, where we can then get a fresh 7 in the middle of going off. Gush is an instant for 4 mana that lets us draw 2 cards, but we can also cast it without paying any mana by returning 2 islands to our hand after we tap them. Smaller cantrips can also be useful to dig for pieces in the early game and replace themselves while adding to our Storm count in the later game. Cards like Ponder, Preordain, and Brainstorm are all cheap ways to dig a few cards deeper into our deck. In Gitaxian Probe and Manamorphose, we can actually cast without losing any mana and dig a card deeper while adding to Storm count. Paradoxical Outcome can be an amazing Storm card if we're lucky enough to end up with a handful of 0 and 1 mana artifacts that tap for mana. So with that, the play looks like this. We cast our cheap artifacts, cast Outcome, return them all after tapping them for mana, draw a card for each one we've bounced, and then recast them, giving us a massive Storm count in a single turn, while also going up on cards, and almost always ending up either net neutral or even positive on mana. Jeska's Will is a flexible storm card that can either generate mana or dig 3 cards deep, both of which we value pretty greatly. We can also take advantage of cards that draw and discard. For example, Faithless Looting and Factor Fiction are great on a small scale, and Frantic Search lets us draw 2, then discard 2, as well as untap 3 lands, which is great with doubling effects. We can actually generate mana, storm, and card advantage, which checks every box for this deck. Wheel of Fortune has both players discard our hands and draw 7, which is a lot better than it looks in this deck. And Bazaar Baghdad taps to let us draw 2 cards and discard 3, which seems like card disadvantage, and on its face it is, but with Storm, the graveyard is more or less an extension of our hand when played strategically. In addition to just card draw, Storm decks almost always want at least a tutor or two to make sure the pieces come in the right order. Demonic, Vampiric, and Mystical Tutor are all cheap and effective. Gamble's another great option because if the card we search up ends up in the bin, we can still make good use of it. And Dark Petition comes with a Dark Ritual staple to it if we have at least 2 spells in the yard when we cast it. Paired with a mana doubler, this can actually find us a card and end up being net neutral on mana. So let's talk about recursion now. Sometimes casting each card once just isn't enough to generate enough spells to reach critical mass, but what if we cast them twice? Snapcaster Mage and Archaeomancer might be the first things that come to mind, and they can definitely be played, but we want to go bigger. 3 cards really shine in this section. Yawgmoth's Will is a black 3-mana sorcery that reads, until end of turn, you may play cards in your graveyard as though they were in your hand. Cards put in your graveyard this turn are exiled. So this is nuts. Remember the Lion's Eye Diamond we talked about earlier? With careful timing paired with this card, LED effectively becomes a Black Lotus in our deck. Past in Flames does a similar job giving instants and sorceries in the yard flashback, and it has flashback itself, so if it ends up in the graveyard somehow, we can still take advantage of it. And Underworld Breach is the newest addition to this trio of enablers. Breach is a 2-mana red enchantment that gives spells in our graveyard escape for the turn. Escape is essentially flashback, but we have to exile 3 cards as well as pay the mana costs. The difference being escape cards don't go back to exile. So with this provided we have enough cards to exile, we can continuously loop something like Black Lotus or Lion's Eye Diamond, generating mana and storm with ease. So we've looked at the cards to get the deck moving. So how do we actually win from here? The more conventional Storm decks are going to take cards like Tendrils of Agony, which of course has Storm, and with each copy drains an opponent for 2 life. This is generally the most straightforward and unconditional win con for the deck. Brain Freeze is another common option, having our opponent mill 3 for each copy, which gets pretty easy in a format where players start with a 32 card deck effectively. The only real problem we run into with Brain Freeze is if our opponent has an Eldrazi or another card that causes them to shuffle their graveyard back into their deck when they hit the bin. In similar fashion to the previous 2, Rakdos Return and Mind Grind serve similar functions, both dealing damage and milling for X. While this isn't technically winning with Storm, they can slot in perfectly to that place as long as we're able to generate enough mana to actually cast them for lethal. Empty the Warrens is another popular Storm win condition, although I personally feel it's one of the more fragile. We can generate 1,000 Goblin Army on our turn, but if they don't have haste and our opponent has a board wipe ready, they aren't going to be very useful. I do like Empty the Warrens in conjunction with cards like Goblin Bombardment, where we can get immediate damage from our creatures, but this is definitely a corner case deck. Ignite Memories is one I don't see a lot of. It reads, target opponent reveals a card at random from their hand, and Ignite Memories deals damage to that player equal to its mana value, and of course has Storm. So sometimes your opponent has nothing in hand and this card is useless, but we have plenty of ways to make sure their hand is full, through wheel effects or even casting a card like Ancestral targeting them. Other times though, they'll be stuck with 1 card in hand that costs 10 plus mana, which at that point doesn't take much for this card to be lethal. Aetherflux Reservoir is another great win condition in a Storm deck. Each time we cast a spell, we gain 1 life for each spell we've cast this turn, which grows exponentially, so by the time we've cast 8 spells in a turn, we've already gained 31 life, which is enough to activate the second ability more often than not, and letting us pay 50 life to deal 50 damage to either a creature or more often a player. Bolas' Citadel is a favorite to pair with this, letting us look at the top card of our library at any time and play the top card by paying life equal to the card's mana value instead of paying any mana for them. We can also sacrifice 10 non-land permanents to have our opponent take 10 if we have some extra artifacts laying around and need that final push. While not typically being a creature-heavy deck, cards like Gutter Snipe are great. Gutter Snipe's a 2/2 red creature for 3 that shoots our opponent for 2 damage whenever we cast an instant or sorcery. which is a great win condition on its own, or just to make it easier for us to get a good Tendrils off. Thousand Year Storm is an Is It enchantment that costs 6 mana that reads, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy it for each other instant and sorcery you've cast before it this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies. So this card is one of the best enablers for a deck like this. Cast a few cantrips like Manamorphose and Gataxian Probe, cast Dark Ritual, turning 1 mana into 9, follow it up with any draw spell and copy it 3 times, burn a few cards in this loop until we can cast something as simple as a Lightning Bolt copied maybe 6 or 7 times to win the game. Thousand Year Storm is a super fun alternative to conventional Storm win conditions, but also pairs great with cards like Tendrils and Brain Freeze to generate even more copies. Mind's Desire is the last card with Storm we're going to talk about. For 6 mana, we get a blue sorcery that reads, shuffle your library, then exile the top card. Until end of turn, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. And of course has Storm. So you can use this to rack up a ton of Storm count and follow up with one of the win cons we've covered, but my favorite way to play Mind's Desire is to build a traditional Storm deck, but include the Eldrazi Titans or other game-winning threats to generate a ton of value and sneak massive creatures into play for free off of Mind's Desire. This is definitely a less consistent strategy, but when it does come together, it is so much fun. Another little combo we can sneak into a deck like this is any mana doubler, Palinchron, and any card with Storm. To make this work, we need 5 lands with a doubler out. Tap our lands, generate 10 mana, cast Palinchron for 7, leaving us with 3 floating. When Palinchron enters, we untap our lands, tap them again, leaving us with 13 mana this time. Use 4 to return Palinchron to hand, leaving us with 9. Use 7 to recast Palinchron, netting us 2 mana in the process, and keep going through this cycle, effectively generating an extra 2 mana each time to give us infinite mana and infinite storm count, which gives us a way to deal lethal damage or mill with only 3 cards. Sometimes splashing this in a combo deck can be an easy way to kind of ease yourself into Storm if you're trying to learn the deck as well. One of my absolute favorite variants of Storm relies heavily on artifacts, and the interaction between Urza and Paradox Engine. Paradox Engine says whenever you cast a spell, untap all non-land permanents you control. And Urza says a lot, but most importantly, he creates an artifact Wheatener's play and gives all of our artifacts the ability to tap for 1 blue mana. So if we have a few artifacts in play, we can tap them all for mana, cast a cheap spell, untap them, float the mana, rinse and repeat. It's important to note that Urza's ability does actually get around Summoning Sickness, so we can tap creatures for mana this way the turn they enter, which is why this works. This engine goes great with Psi Master Thopterist. Whenever you cast an artifact, create a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token that we can tap for mana. Psi also lets us sacrifice 2 artifacts to draw a card, just to keep the gears turning. With enough artifacts, we essentially have infinite mana and the ability to draw our deck, or just play the top of our deck with Urza's other ability. Another pet card for me in Storm decks is Dream Halls. Rather than pay mana for spells, players may discard a card that shares a color with that spell, making everything a force of will kind of thing. So we can use this to pitch cheap cards like Brainstorm or Dark Ritual to cast our Thousand Year Storms and our Yawgmoth's Bargains, and then cast the pitch cards from the graveyard with one of our recursive spells like Yawgmoth's Will or Past in Flames. While Storm is largely not an interactive deck at all, I do encourage you to run a few pieces of removal just to make sure we stay alive long enough to assemble a win. Toxic Deluge and Damnation are great at controlling the board, as well as pinpoint removal like Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, or Heartless Act. Usually before we go off, sometimes it's nice to cast a Thoughtseize or Duress just to check out our opponent's hand for counterspells and make sure the coast is clear for us to start the combo. We also generally benefit from having a few permission spells like Force of Will, Mana Drain, or Counterspell ourselves just to protect our combo and stop our opponents from winning before we do. Being able to take care of problematic creatures and artifacts like Thalia, Eidolon, and Thorn of Amethyst are also top priority. These taxing effects make it incredibly difficult for us to get enough value from our cards to string a win together. Storm is a super fun deck to draft, but sometimes enough pieces don't actually get open to pull the deck together, or you're fighting someone else at the table for pieces and neither of you end up with a functional deck, which is never fun. For this reason, it's best to try not to force an archetype, especially Storm, unless you're very confident and know the environment well. Also, pay attention to signals during the draft, and take note of what cards are coming back to you and which cards that Storm wants are getting picked. Aside from trying to force the deck, the biggest mistake I see newer players make is prioritizing taking win conditions early instead of locking down more important combo pieces. For example, if we open a pack that has both Tendrils of Agony and Yawgmoth's Will early, we almost always want to take Yawgmoth's Will over Tendrils. There are really only 3 comparable cards to this in most cubes, and as we've already discussed, there's no shortage on ways to win. Drafting the opposite is like building a really nice sports car without actually putting an engine inside of it to make it go. So try to pick cards that generate value no matter what, over the cards that aren't the most impressive on their own, even if it's how you win the game. All that said, you'll probably make poor decisions when drafting a deck for the first time, and that's more than okay. It's literally a card game. And with practice, it gets a lot easier.